The night my stepmother shattered my collarbone, I was holding a casserole dish. I remember that detail clearly. The way the ceramic felt warm in my hands, steam still rising from the edges, and how the whole thing shattered on the kitchen tile a half second before I did. It was a Tuesday, February. My dad had been dead for exactly 4 months. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a weak person. I had my own lease, my own car payment, my own credit score I'd built from nothing starting at 19. I was 31 years old and I had never once asked anyone for anything I hadn't earned. I say this not to make myself sound impressive, but because I need you to understand how completely I had been dismantled by the time that dish hit the floor. Strong people get worn down too. That's the part nobody warns you about. My dad raised me alone after my mom left when I was 6. It was just the two of us in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, him working double shifts at the plant, me learning to cook dinner from YouTube tutorials because he never got home before 8. We weren't close in the way people talk about at funerals with golf trips and heart-to-heart conversations. We were close in the way of two people who had survived something together. He knew how I took my coffee. I knew which nights he needed quiet. That was our language. He met her when I was 26. She was 53. He was 60. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. She laughed too loud and wore perfume that filled up every room she walked into, and she called me sweetie from the first day we met in a way that felt less warm than it did territorial. But my dad looked lighter when she was around, and I'd spent a long time wanting him to look lighter. So I smiled. I brought wine to dinners. I bit my tongue so many times I'm surprised it still works. They got married a year later. I was not in the wedding party. She had daughters of her own, 2 of them, both younger than me, and they stood at the altar with her while I sat in the 4th row and told myself it didn't matter. My dad died of a heart attack 14 months after the wedding. He was at work. He went in on a Saturday because there was overtime available, and he had always been a person who did not say no to overtime. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I found out from her. She called me, and the first thing she said, before she told me anything, before she even said his name, was, "I need you to come to the house right away. There are things we need to discuss." Not, "Your father collapsed." Not, "I'm so sorry." Things we need to discuss. I drove to that house in a fog. I sat across from her at the kitchen table he had picked out when I was 12, the one with the scratch near the left leg from when I dropped a chair trying to help him move it, and she told me he was gone. She held a folder while she said it. She already had a folder. The lawyer came 3 days later. My dad had a will. Of course he did. He was meticulous about that kind of thing. And it said that the house was to be held jointly, his estate split evenly between his wife and his daughter. With a separate account he had set aside specifically for me, $42,000 he had been saving since I was a teenager, a college fund I never touched because I put myself through school on scholarships and part-time jobs. He never spent it. He just kept adding to it. The lawyer said my dad had called to update the will 6 weeks before he died. He wanted to make sure I knew about the account specifically. She knew about it too. I didn't understand what was happening at first. She was so warm those first few weeks. She cried in front of me. She held my hand at the funeral and called me her daughter in front of people, which she had never done before, not once in 5 years. She asked me to come to the house on weekends and go through his things, and I did, because I was grieving and I thought she was too. And sometimes grief makes you believe that people are better than they are. It was my cousin who first said something. She pulled me aside after one of those Saturday visits and said, quietly, that she didn't trust the situation, that something felt off. I told her she was wrong. I told her she was projecting. I am not proud of how I spoke to her that day. The first time my stepmother asked me to sign something, I almost did. It was 3 months after my dad died. She presented it as paperwork, estate stuff, she said. Just formalities. The lawyer needed signatures from both of us. I took the papers home that night intending to sign them in the morning, and something stopped me. Not intuition, not some movie-style gut feeling. I just couldn't sleep, so I read them. And then I read them again. And then I called my cousin at 1 in the morning because the papers were not what my stepmother had described. They were a transfer of rights, specifically my rights to the separate account my father had left me. $42,000 my father had spent 20 years saving for me. All I had to do was sign on the line. I didn't sign. I put the papers in a folder of my own and I called a lawyer the next morning. I want to tell you that's when things got better. But that's not what happened. When I told her I wasn't signing, she cried. She said I had misunderstood, that she would never try to take what was mine, that she was hurt I would even think such a thing. She was very good at crying. I had watched her cry at my father's funeral, and I had believed every tear. And now I was watching her cry across a restaurant table, and I could feel something in me shifting, this slow and horrible recalibration. She stopped asking me to sign after that. She stopped calling, too. For a while, I thought it was over. 3 weeks later, her younger daughter showed up at my apartment unannounced. She was 24, small, and she had her mother's eyes in a way that made me feel cold. She said she just wanted to check in. She said her mother missed me. She came inside because I was raised to be polite even when I shouldn't be, and she sat on my couch and looked around my apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read, and when she left, I felt like I needed to check that all my windows were locked. I don't know when my stepmother got a copy of my building's master key. I've thought about it many times. She had met my landlord at one of my dad's retirement dinners. He'd been a family friend for years, and I think she simply asked. She could be charming in a way that made people want to give her things. I came home one Thursday to find that someone had been in my apartment. Nothing was stolen, nothing was obviously disturbed, but things were moved, slightly, subtly, in the way that someone moves things when they're trying to find something and then pretending they were never there. The drawer in my kitchen where I kept important papers was not closed all the way. My laptop had been opened. The folder I had kept the unsigned papers in was sitting at a slightly different angle than I'd left it. I stood in the middle of my living room for a long time. Then I went to my neighbor across the hall, a retired man named Gerald who had lived in that building for 20 years and who I had given my spare key in case of emergencies, and I asked if he had seen anyone go into my apartment. He thought for a moment, said a woman had come by early that afternoon, said she'd told him she was my aunt and that I'd asked her to grab something for me. He had let her in. Gerald felt terrible about it. Still does, I think. But I never blamed him, not really. She had been very convincing. I called my lawyer that night. I called my cousin too, and this time I didn't tell her she was wrong. I found a small camera 3 days later. It was tucked behind a row of books on my shelf, the kind you can buy online for $40, angled toward my desk. I found it because the angle of the books was bothering me, and I moved them. I don't know how long it had been there. I don't know what she was hoping to find. I kept it. I didn't move it. I put a piece of clothing over my laptop camera and I started leaving the apartment every time I needed to discuss anything important. My lawyer later said this was one of the smarter things I did. The camera became evidence. Her older daughter came to see me next. She was different from her sister. Quieter, more careful with her words. She said she just wanted to talk. I let her in because she had caught me off guard and I still, even then, had this aching need to believe that people in difficult situations were not entirely bad. She sat across from me and told me very carefully that her mother was struggling, that the estate was complicated, that there was money going into probate that might take years to resolve. She said her mother was worried about the house, and then she said, so gently I almost didn't hear it, that perhaps I should think about whether I really needed all of what my father had left me. Whether I really needed it. I told her to leave. She was at the door when she turned back and said, quietly, that I should think carefully about how this all looked. A stepdaughter holding up an estate. A daughter being difficult during her grieving mother's worst year. She didn't threaten me, not in any way I could point to. But I understood her perfectly, and I think she knew that. After she left, I sat on the floor for a while. Not the dramatic movie-style collapse. I just sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs were tired and I needed to be low to the ground for a minute. I thought about my dad, about how he had called that lawyer 6 weeks before he died, about how he had updated the will specifically to make sure I knew about that account. He knew. He had seen something or suspected something, and he had done the one thing he could to try to protect me. And then he had gone to work on a Saturday morning and he had not come home. I got up off the floor. I called my cousin and asked if I could stay with her for a few days. I moved the camera first, carefully with gloves so my fingerprints were not on it. I put it in a sealed bag. I left everything else exactly as it was. My cousin drove over and helped me pack a bag. She didn't say I told you so, not once. What happened next took 4 months, and I want to be honest with you about what 4 months of legal process feels like because nobody ever talks about that part. It is slow and expensive, and it involves sitting in small rooms with fluorescent lighting while people speak in careful language about your dead father's wishes and your stepmother's interpretation of those wishes. My lawyer was a woman named, she preferred I not name her publicly, which I respect, and she was precise and calm in a way that made me want to be precise and calm too. She had done this before. She knew what she was looking at. The camera was illegal. In Ohio, recording someone in their home without consent is a crime, and the fact that it was my home made it worse for my stepmother, not better. The unauthorized entry, documented through my building's external security footage showing her arrival that Thursday afternoon, added to it. The unsigned transfer papers, combined with a recorded phone call from a few weeks earlier in which my stepmother had referenced the account in a way that made her intent very clear, were enough. She did not go to trial. She settled. I want to be honest about that too because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, she should have gone to jail. Maybe she should have. My lawyer presented me with two options. Pursue criminal charges, which would be a long process with an uncertain outcome and would keep me tied to this woman for potentially another year or more, or accept the civil settlement, which would secure the account, recover legal fees, and include a no-contact agreement that had real teeth to it. I chose the second option. I am not ashamed of that choice. Survival is not always the dramatic path. Sometimes survival is the path that gets you free the fastest. My stepmother paid back every cent she had attempted to access from the estate, plus my legal fees, plus an additional amount I'd rather not name. Her name was removed from any ongoing claims to my father's separate account. She kept the house. My dad had wanted that, and I was not willing to fight over a place where someone had trespassed in my home and planted surveillance equipment and stood across a restaurant table crying while she tried to steal from me. That house was not mine anymore, not in any way that mattered. Gerald got me a very nice bottle of wine when it was over. He cried a little. I told him he had nothing to apologize for, and I meant it. My cousin flew out to see me the week the settlement was finalized. We sat on my new apartment's balcony. I had moved, obviously, immediately the moment I could afford to, and we drank wine and she said, "You know I knew something was wrong." I said yes. She said, "You should have listened to me sooner." I said yes to that too. There are things I would do differently. I would have read everything before I went to that first meeting. I would have hired a lawyer the week my dad died, not 3 months later. I would have changed my locks the day she showed up at the funeral with that folder already in her hands. I would have listened to my cousin the first time she said something felt wrong instead of dismissing her because I was too tired to believe she was right. I think about my dad a lot. I think about how hard he worked to leave me something. Not just the money, but the intention behind it. The care. The foresight. He knew. He saw who she was before I did, and he did the one thing in his power to try to take care of me even after he was gone. The account is still there. I haven't touched most of it. It doesn't feel like money to me. It feels like the last conversation I had with him, the one where he said without words that he loved me and that he was paying attention and that he hoped I would be okay. I am okay. It took a while. I am okay. If you are somewhere in this story, if you recognize the folder on the table, the too warm smile, the small things in your apartment that aren't quite where you left them, I want to tell you the thing I needed someone to tell me. You are not overreacting. You are not difficult. You are not a bad daughter or a bad person for protecting what is yours, especially when what is yours was given to you by someone who loved you. Document everything. Read everything. Call the lawyer before you think you need one, and listen to your cousin the first time. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly in the early mornings before work when my coffee is still too hot to drink and my apartment is finally mine, in a way it never used to feel. I think about the choices that led to other choices, the folder she already had in her hands at my father's funeral, the papers I almost signed without reading, the drawer that wasn't quite closed. Every single thing that happened was the result of something that came before it, and when I trace it back far enough, I keep landing on the same place, the moment she decided I was someone she could take from. That's what I want to talk about, because I think it's the part that matters most. She made a calculation. She looked at me, a woman who had been raised to be polite, to smooth things over, to not make situations harder than they already were, and she decided I was soft enough to move around. What she didn't calculate was that my father had raised me to read things carefully. He was a man who read every form before he signed it, every lease, every warranty, every receipt. He did it quietly and without fanfare, and I watched him do it my entire childhood without fully understanding why. I understood why when I sat at my kitchen table at midnight with those transfer papers in my hands and something made me slow down. That was him. That was $42,000 of savings, and a will he updated 6 weeks before he died, and a lifetime of teaching me, without words, to pay attention. The intelligence that protected me wasn't dramatic or special, it was just patience. It was reading slowly when everything in me wanted to trust and move on. It was calling my lawyer when I didn't want to make trouble. It was listening, finally, too late, but not too late, to my cousin, who had seen clearly from the beginning what I was too exhausted and too grieving to see. And Gerald. I think about Gerald a lot. He let her in because she was convincing and he had no reason not to believe her, and he carried that guilt for months. But Gerald is also the person who told me the truth the moment I asked. He didn't protect himself. He didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He looked me in the eye and told me exactly what he'd seen, and that honesty, that one simple act of telling the truth, was the thread that unraveled everything she had tried to build. One honest person in a hallway. That's all it took. I think that's the thing I want to leave you with. Not a lesson, exactly. I'm not in a position to teach anyone anything, just something I noticed. The people who tried to take from me did so carefully, slowly, with smiles and tears and soft language about family. And the people who protected me did so simply without calculation, just by being honest and paying attention and showing up. My cousin, Gerald. My father in the only way he had left. You don't have to be extraordinary to protect yourself. You have to be willing to read the document, to ask the uncomfortable question, to believe the person who loves you when they say something feels wrong, even when believing them is harder than not. She made a calculation. She was wrong about me, and the distance between who she thought I was and who I actually am, that gap, that miscalculation, is the reason I'm sitting here in my own apartment, with my father's savings intact, drinking coffee that's finally cool enough. That's enough for me.